Okay, thank you. It's Tuesday afternoon, 4 p.m. in Switzerland, and it's Space Café Web Talk time. Our Space Café Web Talk, 33 minutes with Pacome Revillon, will begin soon. And I hope, Pacome, that I pronounced your surname correctly. So
it's just perfect, Torsten. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for our talk today, live from the World Satellite Business Week. And as always, we appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback. I'm Torsten Kriening, your host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. And we are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I know many of you are already familiar with the website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and our Space Café podcast. So the latest episode features the wonderful Barbara Belvisi of Interstellar Lab and the future of plant growth in space and on Earth. For all our fans of audio content, we have new episodes in our Space Café radio, where we talk with interesting people on the road, on shows and at conferences. We keep also our fan shop open online for you to support us actively and become a space watcher. And I already talked about our supporter program to keep our independent work alive. And if you missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our website in the events section and on YouTube. I'm very honored to get the chance to speak to my guest today, as he has to be on a dozen other places at the same time these days. Thank you very much for accepting even this online version of our talk, as I was supposed to be in Paris, but not brave enough to travel these days. So a very warm welcome, Pacome Revillon. Pacome is the Chief Executive Officer of EuroConsult and based in Paris in France, and with that also the host of the World Satellite Business Week these days. In his 18 years working in the space sector, Pacome has led EuroConsult's strategy and operation and consults with high-level clients, particularly in the satellite, broadcasting, communication and finance. And under his management, the company has experienced a continuous expansion internationally and has strengthened its position as an international reference on the strategic, economic and financial aspects of space activities. And his work experience includes position with the DLR in Germany and Thales in France, and he holds a graduate engineering degree in telecommunication and space from SuperAero and a master's degree in economics from DESIA. And again, Pacome, welcome to our Space Café today, and thank you for finding the time. So let's kick it off. Congratulations, first of all, for this excellent World Satellite Business Week so far. I mean, you're almost halfway done. Even under the current situation, you attracted top-level speakers from the entire sector, like every year. Being at the end of the second day now, what is your first feedback from your conference this year?
Thanks, Torsten, and mentioning I'm honored to be here as well. So thanks a lot for the invitation in the Space Café. So, I mean, on the event, the first thing I could say is that I'm quite happy we could have it live, which is the first thing for those 2 days, as we call it from the start. What would be an augmented edition, meaning online and on-site. I was expected more on-site, and in the last 2 weeks, obviously we've been managing and discussing with dozens, hundreds of organizations to see how to look at priorities, needs, concerns around travel, COVID, and everything you could imagine. So at the end of the day, I think on those 4 days, we have approximately more than 600 people who could make the move. And we also have over 1,100 with our online participants. And really, I want to thank all and every person who take part of all that process up to today. So really yesterday, today, a number of the sessions, and most of them hybrid, let's say, focus on the transformation of our sector. And interestingly enough, I mean, despite this period, it's been a pretty, again, unique year for the space sector. When you think of the financing, our number of companies could come to the point where they are now in a position to deploy their infrastructure. constellations that came into orbit, but also all the M&As has been big topics around global operators, the announced combination of Viasat in Marsat, for example. So a number of those topics, but also access to space. And I was just out of a session on the ground segment where virtualization, software-defined approaches to space activities is also becoming as a big topic for the next 2 to 3 years.
I mean, you mentioned the transformation of the sector, and I would like to dig into that a bit. I mean, it's a major topic you cover in your work, but also, as you mentioned, has been a topic for the last 2 days in the conference. So the transformation of this entire ecosystem from a new space approach to an mature space approach, or we want to call it. So can you share your observations with us briefly before we then later on go into further details, because it's that the most interesting topic that for all of us has a relevance, obviously.
Sure. I think where we are today is a bit of a new space, as it was called, to more companies certainly getting established and getting to a form of new normal, but it's also the time for the new space business. So many of the companies are really coming to the point where they are starting their commercial operations, or they will do so next year or the year after. So it's really where we are in that time of change. And really, I mean, we released our annual kind of market intelligence on the satellites to be deployed over the decade, where you could have various estimates. We estimate there could be over 17,000 satellites delivered into orbit. And this may even not consider some of the latest filings, ambitions that have been published or released by some companies in the last 2-3 months. And this clearly where the change would come out of, close to 200, at least 270 constellation projects we could assess, review. Not all of them will make it to orbit, but from connectivity to remote sensing to IoT and everything. So that's clearly a big play. And admittedly, this industry is split between the mega constellations that maybe would deploy, maybe 4 or 5 companies would deploy half of the total of the satellites we expect. But then it will be over 100 organizations, at least public, private, who are to deploy constellation for various purposes. And that's really the change, the volume, the scale, the software approach, the flexibility of the assets, and obviously the huge volume of data, either for communication or data collection, remote sensing, and the rest.
Just out of curiosity, did you include the 330,000 satellites Rwanda filed as well into your analytics?
So admittedly, it was a bit recent. We're lacking some perspective. So I think more seriously about a number of those filings, and it was one of them. What we've seen in the last 3 months on the one side is some companies already taking position in new frequency bands like QV, so looking at the next stage. That particular project is especially ambitious in numbers, but talking about like 10 kilogram satellites, very small ones. But as well, one would appreciate also the time it takes from the filing to actually deliver into orbit. So we're talking now about SpaceX, OneWeb, and others making trials, getting into orbit. So the story started at least 5 years ago, if not more. So it's a journey. So even thinking of today, some of these pure new filings would look towards the second half of the period. So it's where I'm saying, compared even to some of our forecasts, you could see huge numbers, but there would be upside. There would be scenarios with even more satellites, which could also raise some topics like SSA that we may cover later.
Absolutely. I mean, looking back on the year 2021, what are the key aspects you keep in mind from this year in the space sector? And what are the things that will remain in our general memories for 2021, beside the obvious big C thing? And then we come to the outlook, of course, for the next year.
Well, I think there are 2 to 3 that are kind of milestones or transformative. I mentioned about the constellations, but to have a number of them being in trials and actual service is still a step change, because even for clients, user, you are a project and then you start becoming a reality. And then obviously dynamics even change. One, I think, is everything around space flights, around human in space. Obviously, space tourism has been something major in the year. And clearly the momentum we see with governments to look at space exploration. There were some milestones in space logistics, maybe not as much in the news, but that I think important and paving the way for the future growth there. And certainly the number of fundraising being announced, the number of companies that could merge with SPACs, getting hundreds of $millions, making a number of those companies and aspiring projects really in a position to get into orbit and to the next stage is partly changing the game, changing the competitive ecosystem, but also the services being delivered. So to me, these are kind of three major items out of this year, outside of the rest of everyone adapting to the new dynamics. I must say maybe the last one would be still even some new deals and announcements announced by a company like Microsoft, Amazon, and others. Clearly, that approach, the approach of data centers, cloud, etc., is another big item for the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, both Microsoft and Amazon are visiting your conference and making quite big waves, I have to say. So it's curious to see what's going on. When you talked about space logistics, you talked about the MEV stocking and the in-orbit servicing demonstration. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of. So when we use that word, we tend to use quite a large umbrella in terms of the activities to cover. I mean, certainly anything around debris removal is one, anything about docking and life extension is one. Certainly also on the kind of security defense side, there is interest in some capabilities. So, but also looking at some companies developing now projects around data relays, where maybe a perspective is, as opposed to have satellites going to the ground, maybe you could use a third party to just bring back your data to one of those data relay satellites and to the ground. So to a certain extent, for the satellites being in the sky, it's kind of an ecosystem of platform and services promoted by different companies. So not all of them are still fully ready yet, but we see that coming, and we see, a couple of debris removal atoms and such docking, etc. Clearly, yes, getting to the stage where it may be not fully commercial yet, but it's kind of being demonstrated.
Got it. Okay, wrapping up this year. So what are the top space trends for the next year? Enlighten us, please, with your crystal ball.
If I knew everything, that would be better, even for EuroConsult and our business. But obviously some of the trends we just continue. I think on the constellation side, a number of companies will just reach that new milestone where they get commercial. Mergers and acquisition, kind of restructuring of the ecosystem, I think will continue to accelerate because of what just happened, because of announcements such as the Viasat in Marsat merger, because of the new kind of competitive landscape. There is obviously a rationale and a need for companies to rethink their business positioning and think whether M&A, new business combinations, new capabilities would be required to remain relevant in the industry as it becomes. So that will be one of the important drivers. And depending on regions, in Europe, certainly ministerial, European Union, to make maybe decisions around their constellation, connectivity, secure connectivity, constellation ambition. That could be one. So several bricks there. Interestingly as well, in the launch sector, next year may be a bit tight, but if not next year, the year after, some of the launch systems for small satellites are getting to the trial phase or may get operational next year or the year after. So part of that offering, those new developments are to come again as well to the commercial service. So that's really one characterization of this time, I think.
Thanks for bringing this up, the small launchers. I mean, Constellation, we will come to as a next question, but I mean, we have seen the last days some interesting announcements for the new studies that were awarded from the European Commission to, I think, New Symphony is one, and UNIO we published this morning. That's interesting developments, but let's have a deeper look into the small launcher market, as you mentioned, in Europe with the dynamics and primarily driven at the moment out of Germany, but also globally. So what is your prediction? What is your forecast? What are the challenges that we will see coming from them? I mean, beside getting anything into orbit, of course.
No, but I mean, when you look at the companies, I think there are 2 to 3 important stakes. So I mentioned earlier about our forecast of 17,000 satellites. That would mean essentially about 1,700 per year on average, and some form maybe of stability from where we are after a first big increase in the number of satellites being deployed per year, but also a need for replenishment, so more maybe of a stable market, let's say. But into that, first, you would recognize that there will be just a few constellations with thousands of satellites, but one client maybe for several companies, and admitting you can launch the right size or the right type of assets. And obviously among them, SpaceX would be fully vertically integrated. So I think for any company in that game, the first question is really to look at what's the addressable market for me and for my capability. Under that review, it's quite interesting to see that some companies are already looking at their next generation, Rocket Lab being just one example. They've already announced that they're already looking at a bigger satellite and reusability. So I think for any launch company, you would get to your first capability, but already you would be planning, looking at your roadmap, let's say, for expansion. Then some companies on a case-by-case basis would look at whether you want to be a launch company or a launch company only or a launch company plus. So a company like Astra has put filing to become a satellite operator, to have the 2 activities. So I think it depends partly on each company and its positioning, but how to create economic value and a return, and whether it's purely in the launch or in the launch and some side activities is certainly pretty important. And for them and for the access to market, I think we'll certainly see the brokers having an important role, because making the connection between the launchers and the variety of projects and time frame and everything remains a difficult task for any company. And I think the brokers making that link between clients and the launch service providers will be pretty key to make the economy and the industry working, for sure.
And brokers or the companies you're having in mind are those that are integrating also the small satellites or the constellations into the launchers, so the orbit, spaceflight, exolaunch, and so on. Is that correct?
Exactly, those type of companies that would bring together clients. So obviously some of them, they would have large rides over a heavy launcher, that's one, but they would also be here to look at the time frame, the right launcher, and be able to assess some clients' needs and make the link with the launch company. As you would appreciate, as in almost anything in space, you have a launch service, but you may have clients, companies all around the world, and with that flurry of projects on the one side of various sizes, needs, and so forth, it's pretty difficult for a launch company to address all of the clients up front directly. So obviously, you may target some priority clients that you may want really to target yourself, but you will definitely have a need for aggregators and intermediaries to help you to make the connection for some demand in Asia if you're a European launcher or US or whatever.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, on that note, and then we close the chapter of the small launchers. We had yesterday the announcement that Germany awarded the DLR/ESA awarded the first payload for the Virgin flight of ESA Aerospace. So that's an interesting development, and I would say the first time in Europe that we see that the government becomes the anchor customer, something what the market is demanding from or the European market is demanding for quite some time. Let's move on to the NGSO market, and I mean we have 8 more minutes, so we stay on time. The NGSO are we love our abbreviation, the non-geostationary orbit. So, or we can say LEO as well, but it's not that cool. However, it's the same area, gets some dynamics, and to say it at least. I mean, you mentioned it. Our contributor and market expert, Ronald van der Breggen, wrote very openly about the challenges and the risks. And you also just released your study that you just mentioned a moment ago. So what is your view in light of the next year on that? So how sustainable is this market? How risky is this market?
Well, so I think, see, you have different ways to look at it, but obviously especially if we talk connectivity and large constellations, you obviously talking about a multi-billion investment. So if you just make the math, whatever the way you look at it, if you make that multi-billion investment and you have costs running, if you are to make a very short-term profit, maybe you make $1 billion in 1, 2, 3 years, whatever. But obviously, it's still capex driven. You have a clock running, so these are challenging economics. Also, it's transformative, and once you have assets capability into orbit, you've built something that will still have a long-term value, and you've taken a position there. Which is also why some of those companies got pretty high valuation when they raised funds. So when you also look at the reality of the market, it's true for connectivity. It's also true for remote sensing, for example. Obviously, these are new businesses to build, kind of data-centric businesses that do not fully exist today. It's really expansion. So it's no big surprise if you look at the last, if you look at what the space industry was a decade ago, you would have had 80% of the funds raised for new infrastructure being debt. Mm-hmm. And the rest was some equity here and there, but really the bulk of it was debt. If you look at the last 3 years, maybe, you would find it's almost the opposite, like 80% would have been equity, because those projects clearly have a high level of risk, much more than what some lenders certain of the projects, especially for first generation and especially for pure startup companies. So it's case by case, but it's no surprise that for almost every project, the equity, meaning investors, stakeholders, eager to take a higher level of risk, but also thinking of the upside and the long-term benefits, and what is the first or second generation is important. So there's a risk, yes, and you're also looking for investors in equities that may have a view that will be long-term enough for you to aim at establishing the business. So that I think where we are. And then once business mature and revenues exist, maybe we'll come back to more of a period looking for more debt and a more balance between equity and debt. But really, it's a very entrepreneurial period. Someone thinks there's no risk attached, honestly, would have maybe to be a bit blind, but there is also certainly value creation.
Mm. I mean, with all that launchers, the launcher market, the satellites in space, the satellites to come, we should talk about one topic that is very close to our heart at SpaceWatch.Global, and I know also on your end, space sustainability, space SSA or space traffic management. So what is your view in terms of the next year? Where are we heading? I mean, are we going full throttle to the next catastrophe in space in that time, or will we manage it somehow? And then based on what, I mean, will we come to a global policy? Will we have a solution? Because even Astroscale or Clear Space and all their great work, what they do, I mean, it's less than a drop on a hot stone, as we know.
Yeah, I think it's pretty early stage. So it's fair to say that the regulation that already exists make it quite difficult to have a lot of constraints on the system. So obviously the power that some countries would have is to give a licensing or landing rights, the FCC. I mean, on top of the ITUs, the FCC in the US, some of the markets. So there is some influence there, but it's a fair statement that as of today, it's not really regulated or regulated in a way that can really manage or deny access on the purpose that it's putting other assets too much at risk. So I know a lot of simulations exist and are being run, and we are in that gray area where for sure there will be issues and more issues moving forward. At the same time, the number of actual collisions has remained pretty limited and may not be so many in the near term. So there actually could be a time and a point where either for interference or collision issue, it would become a major problem. And I think that is coming. The other thing that we would see is that the orbits for the operational systems are coming closer to us. And actually, it's coming closer to the orbits where you have human space flight, International Space Station, other assets, whereby obviously the risk of any collision and the actual risk for human being in space increases. So I think out of all those trends, for sure, there will be a need to act. So certainly first on SSA monitoring, having kind of a permanent monitoring of assets, really sensors are multiplying on the ground, which is kind of a first step. On the step of making action in the sky, I think it could come from either policy, but also from certain of the clients. I mean, really thinking of other industry, looking at air traffic management, but looking, for example, at fishery. Right now, if you want, as a foreign country or any country to sell fishes in Europe, you would need to have kind of a sustainable development policy and management policy of your waters to have a sustainable fishery industry. Otherwise, you will be denied to sell into the European market. So not saying it's necessarily perfect, but the action from certain countries would also be to attach your ability to sell into the region to also certain form of behaviors in the long term. So I'm not in secret discussions, but for sure I'm pretty sure there's a rationale for that to be discussed between now and the middle of the decade in the number of satellites to deploy. It's difficult to imagine that we can just continue without any form of management of those assets.
Thank you very much for this view on it. I mean, we will continue our awareness building on space situation awareness, on the environment situation, with SpaceWatch.Global as we go, and we would like to get your or your company's feedback and input as we go for the next year as well. So we have Christmas around the corner. So what is your wish in terms of space for the next year?
Yeah, what is your wish? No, I think honestly, the space industry has been moving so quickly and so innovative. So a number of those projects are crystallizing as we speak. So I wish, and to many of the companies, I think it will happen. It's always a question of time. So I wish that all of those new projects starting commercialization and others are actually meeting their market, and that it also demonstrates that it's just not a promise of everything great that space can do, but that it actually turns into benefits for end users, experience, how it actually contributes to to end users, to our daily life, etc. And I think for the space sector, it got a lot of exposure in the last 2 to 3 years. But if it can now, as I said, become operational, even more demonstrate the benefits of it, I think will be very important to keep the momentum and even grow it in afterwards.
Thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure talking to you. So
hopefully last week maybe that we can see each other here together in Paris next year.
Absolutely. I mean, at least I'm planned to go to Brussels end of January to the EU Space Conference. Let's see. I mean, let's see what these mutants are giving us.
All the best.
I'm afraid that we have to come to an end. So even so, I would really like to continue this talk with you. It's very, very inspirational. So before we finish, dear audience, do not miss. It's the last week with our Space Cafes this year. Tomorrow we will run our Space Café Brazil by Ian Grosvenor in Portuguese at 6 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, and then on Thursday morning for us in Europe, we will run our next Space Café Australia by Annie Handmar with Troy McCann. So money and space is their topic. And then happy holidays to all of you. And and then next year we will start the 33 minutes on the 4th of January with Alice Gorman from Australia. On the 11th, I have the pleasure talking with Professor Anke Kaiser-Pizzala, the head of DLR. On the 13th, we have a special event by our friends from the Space Arbitration Court. Does outer space need arbitration? Then I'm following up with Peter Hulsroy. And on the 25th, I'm planned to go live from the EU Space Conference in Brussels. All events going to be online on Eventbrite. And as always, we would like to hear your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up to our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. And if you like to treat yourself with something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us in our supporter program. Thank you very much, Pacome, for this inspiring talk and being my guest. Thanks to the entire team behind the scenes for doing their great job and smooth job week by week again. Hope you all will stay safe and stay healthy in the coming weeks. And thanks for joining us. Hope to see you tomorrow or in the new year. In the meantime, visit our website or follow us on social media. And don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you very much.
Thanks.